Hello. It is my great privilege. I am very enthusiastic to have this opportunity to talk with you today about a topic that I've spent really my entire career, over 40 years, studying and investigating and writing about. So it's just very exciting that I have an opportunity to present with you, educators in Spain, about best practices in gifted identification. The only disappointment, and it's a grave disappointment for me, is that I'm not there with you in person in Spain. I love travel. I love Spain. I've been to your beautiful country a number of times. Maybe some of you, in fact, heard me speak recently in Madrid. So I wish I was giving this talk in person so we could interact. It's always a little artificial to give a talk virtually, but hopefully this will make a lot of sense to you, what we're doing virtually, and you'll gain a lot of information and new ideas from today's presentation. So why don't we begin? Let's go to the second slide. Okay. What I plan to cover in the next 2 to 3 hours are about 7 or 8 topics that are very important in understanding best practices in screening, testing, identifying, assessing high ability, or what we call gifted students in the schools. I'll be talking a little bit about, because we really need to first talk about this, who are the gifted? Who are gifted kids? Who are these high ability youngsters that we're talking about? So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Next, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a few myths that still exist in the gifted field. And we really need to talk about those and clarify what are facts, what are science from what are myths. There are some myths that can get in the way of our doing good service for high ability students. Third thing I'm going to talk about and introduce is this idea of talent development models. Talent development models are relatively new. They're models that have been around about 20 years. When I was trained as a clinical psychologist almost 50 years ago, there really were no talent development models in high ability or gifted education. But now we have them, and they're exciting because they expand our understanding of how to work with gifted and talented students. From talking about the different talent development models, I'm going to shift a little and talk with you about my own model, my model of academic giftedness. It's called the tripartite model. It consists of tripartite, or 3 different components that help us have a little more complete or comprehensive view of the gifted student. We'll then talk a little bit about levels of giftedness. That's important for us to understand if we're going to approach how to best identify gifted students. And the last 2 topics I'll conclude with are: one, what are best practices in gifted identification? We'll go over 6 or 7 best practices in Spain, in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, in Africa, and South America. I've lectured about this important topic all over the globe, and I think it's helpful to educators, to special educators, to gifted educators, to psychologists, to understand best practices in gifted identification. And then I'll conclude the lecture introducing a test that I developed back in 2003, and then we revised in 2022, 2023, the Gifted Rating Scale, or the GRS. And I'll talk a little bit about the new Gifted Rating Scale, the GRS2. So a lot to cover, and I'm lecturing in English, and I apologize that I'm not presenting in Spanish, but hopefully I'll proceed slowly enough that it'll make sense, and the translated versions will help you greatly. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, before we get serious, let's be a little unserious. Let's have some fun looking at this is a cartoon of a man sitting on a chair taking notes as this big elephant is lying down on his couch. And why do I share this cartoon? The reason is it's an example of behind the scenes, behind the curtain, what goes into constructing a gifted test item. When we initially developed my first gifted rating scale back in 2003, when I was a professor at Duke University, one of the things we wanted to include in our gifted rating scale were items on humor. There was a belief, untested, but it was a belief that gifted kids have a better sense of humor. They're funnier than kids who are not gifted. There was a sense that kids who have higher IQs have a better sense of humor than kids who don't have high IQs. But there was no research supporting this. And we thought, well, let's look at some items and see if they can distinguish between high IQ kids and lower IQ kids in terms of humor. So we developed this set of items, which I love. I borrowed this from, it's a well-known weekly New Yorker magazine where each week they have a cartoon and they ask readers to write in what would be the funniest caption that you can come up with for this silly little cartoon. And hundreds upon hundreds of readers write in funny captions, and the editors of the New Yorker magazine each week pick the 3 funniest captions. And it's great. I love it. I love it. So we thought, well, let's come up with the same thing, and we're going to give this cartoon to hundreds and hundreds of kids and adolescents across the United States. And let's see if, in fact, humor is something that differentiates high IQ kids from lower IQ kids. So this is just one example. And if I was in person with you, I would have each of you write down what you think is the funniest caption for this little cartoon. And if I was in person, I would say, okay, read off your caption. And the audience would laugh and chuckle, and we have a good funny time about that. The bottom line, though, takeaway is it's not so easy to develop items to measure constructs such as humor. And in fact, what we found in our research was that we couldn't come up with measures of humor that differentiated high ability, high IQ kids from low ability, lower IQ kids. We thought humor was something that gifted kids are particularly good at, but really the research didn't support that. Some high IQ kids are funny, really funny, but some are not funny. Some are brilliant in a lot of different ways, but they're not real funny. So this is an example of one of the items that we developed, one of thousands of items that we tried over 3 years, trying to see, can we differentiate giftedness based on sense of humor? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So what I want to start off with, as I mentioned, talking to you about a few myths in the gifted field. These are important to expose and shed light on, because if we don't, we treat them as fact when in fact they're not fact. So let's start with the next slide. Okay, so the first myth is probably the most prevalent myth in all of gifted education, in all of the gifted field. In the United States, in Spain, in Europe, I work in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in Germany, and France, wherever I travel, in South America, in Brazil, in Argentina, in the Middle East, in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, wherever I travel, this is the number one most prevalent belief that is a myth. It's not real. And it's the myth that giftedness is something real, that being gifted is just like being tall or having curly hair or red hair or blue eyes, or it's just like if you have diabetes or if you have a genetic disorder like Fragile X syndrome, or if you have breast cancer. Those are things that are real in nature. But alas, giftedness is not real. Giftedness is a label, what we call a social invention, a social construct, nothing more. It's useful. It's a very useful construct. It's a useful way to try to group kids, but it's not real. It's not like if I was a medical doctor trying to identify kids at high risk for type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, we identify and test based on biochemical and genetic and neurophysiologic markers. We don't have that in terms of giftedness. Giftedness is a label that we humans have devised that helps us group and categorize and recognize individuals, children, adolescents, adults who are special, exceptional, who perform at a high level in culturally valued domains. But we need to be careful not to think that a gifted child is uniquely different, because it's really a social construct. It's not something that exists in nature. And I'll talk more about this throughout this morning's presentation. But this is an important myth, that giftedness is something real. It's not, but it's useful. Okay, if we can differentiate that it's not real, but it's a useful idea or construct for grouping kids. Okay? Okay, next slide, please. This second myth is the companion to the first myth. And the second myth says that giftedness not only is not real, but it's not necessarily only high IQ. For over 130 years, writers have proposed that being gifted means you're born with a high IQ. And the higher the IQ, the more gifted, and it never changes. The myth also argues that if you're born with a higher IQ, you share certain unique personality characteristics and traits and behaviors that only other kids with high IQ possess or share. This is not true. When we've conducted really hard-nosed research, what we find is many kids who don't have very high IQs are gifted in a lot of areas, as I'll talk about shortly. And that there is no one set of unique characteristics that demarcate gifted kids from students who are not gifted. Gifted kids vary tremendously in the behaviors, the traits, the characteristics. Just as I start out saying with sense of humor, some gifted kids have a great sense of humor. Look at some of the most famous comics in the world. They're all brilliant, but not everyone is a great comic or a stand-up comedian. Some gifted kids are shy, but not all. Some are very outgoing and gregarious. Some are loud, some are quiet. Some love the arts and theater. Others only like science and engineering and chemistry. So gifted kids vary tremendously. All right, next slide. This third myth complements the first two. And what it says is that giftedness and gifted children represent individuals with unique personality traits. A dear colleague of mine who I worked with, Professor Jim Delisle, he believes this. He writes about this. He really believes that giftedness is really who you are, not what you do. So remember that. His view is giftedness is who you are as a person. It makes up the entirety of your person. It's not what you do. You'll hear throughout the day my view, Stephen Pfeiffer's view in the tripartite model. This is not the case. Giftedness really is what you do, what you accomplish, what you pursue. It's not who you are as a person. The Columbus Group wrote about 20 years ago that giftedness is essentially asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensities combine to create an inner experience that's qualitatively different from kids who are not gifted. It's a myth. We've done a lot of research, and other investigators have done a lot of hard-nosed research, and we've found that this isn't the case. Some gifted kids, as I'll talk about later today, do show asynchronous development, but not all, not all. Some kids have a propensity for higher intensity, heightened sensitivities to touch, to sound, to smell, to feel, but not all gifted kids. So we need to be careful not to mistakenly label gifted all the same when in fact there's very little research to support that they show unique personality traits. It's just not true. It's a myth. Next slide. Okay. The fourth myth in the gifted field, this is also quite prevalent in here still in the United States, when I give talks around the United States, as well as when I travel internationally, that a single test and a single test score can identify gifted kids. Going back to the first studies using the term giftedness, Terman in the United States used the Binet IQ test score to track a few hundred children who were tested with very high IQ, and he followed them for decades. And his belief was that general intelligence, or what we call little g, general intelligence, is a powerful, a robust predictor of academic success and success in life. And why do we still hold on to this? Going back, starting in like 1905, 1910 were the early studies. We still, with all the advances made in many fields, why do we still hold on that? The reason is IQ tests are reliable, they're very well developed, and they are inexpensive to use. So educators, administrators, test developers promote this notion that one test, the IQ test, can identify gifted students. The other reason is it's costly and complicated if you use multiple measures. But what you're going to hear me talk about over and over in today's lecture is that even though just using an IQ test is a simple way of going about things, sometimes we miss the mark when we approach things too simply and don't look more comprehensively in a more nuanced way. And I'm not sure what the word for nuance is in Spanish, but that we look more thoughtfully and carefully at all aspects of a child in determining whether they are gifted or not. So we'll talk more about that. But the myth, a single test, an IQ test, is going to identify kids, not necessarily true. IQ tests are important. They're valuable. I still use it in my clinical practice. I've tested literally thousands of kids with IQ tests. So it's a valuable tool, but it's not the only one. And we need to think more comprehensively in a more nuanced way. Next slide. Okay, the fifth myth in the gifted field, and this is a pernicious myth. It's so hard to shake people of the idea that once gifted, you're always gifted. If you're born gifted, you're gifted your whole life. Doesn't matter what you do, what you accomplish, how hard you work. If you're born gifted, then you're gifted. The other side of that is if you're born not gifted, then it doesn't matter what you do, you're never going to be gifted. It's fascinating to me how many parents and educators and professionals still hold on to this myth, once gifted, always gifted. If a child is tested as gifted, parents then really hang on to this. Oh, my son, my daughter is gifted. And they want to argue that their child should be in a gifted program their entire life because they're gifted. Doesn't change. However, this is a myth. It's really the fifth myth in the gifted education field. It's contrary to all the best research that we have, and it's contrary to what we know about talent development, that many, many different factors go into high performance in most, if not all, fields. And what we'll talk about in talent development models is the reaching of expertise. IQ will only get you so far. There's many other factors that are combined that lead kids to be successful as they get older. So once gifted, always gifted, it's a myth, not necessarily true. Next slide, please. Okay. I added this sixth myth just because as a professor, as an academic, we sometimes get concerned when hot new fads, and I don't know what the word is in Spanish for fads, but new ideas break through the public media and people get very excited about it. And we have to be careful. They occur in education, in medicine, in engineering, in government, in politics, in gifted education. And the myth is that there are simple solutions to the very complicated challenges that we face in educating bright, high ability, gifted students. It's a myth. If only life were that easy, if only simple solutions would be the answer to our complex problems, but it's rarely the case. And two examples are Carol Dweck's work on mindset or implicit theories, and Fredrickson and Losada's critical positivity ratio. So let me start first with Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is a colleague, a brilliant developmental psychologist who came up with this idea that's really important and has had a real impact on high ability gifted field of mindset, that if you have a positive mindset, if you're open to change, if you're willing to grow, or a growth mindset she talks about, you're going to face challenges and not give up. You're going to persist. You're going to work very, very hard. So irrespective of your IQ, if you have a positive or open mindset, you recognize that you make mistakes. Mistakes are good. It's not a reflection of how smart or dumb you are, and that you build upon your mistakes. So positive mindset is best. The problem with the mindset work is we've oversimplified it in the gifted field, and we've sort of categorized now children as either open or closed mindsets. And life is not that simple. So we need to be a little more thoughtful in applying Carol Dweck's brilliant research to our understanding of how to develop what we call grit or persistence, or kids continuing to work hard to achieve whatever the challenge might be in the classroom or in life. The second related myth about simple solutions is Fredrickson, who was a colleague of mine. She's a professor at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Fredrickson and Losada came up with what they said is a critical positivity ratio, that if you reinforce students, including gifted students, 3 positive for 1 negative, it'll change their life. It's an interesting idea. It's a good parenting idea, and it's a good kind of motivational that kids respond better to positive than negative feedback. We all do. Adults do as well. Teachers respond more favorably to positive feedback than negative. When principals come in and administrators, you're probably all familiar with the sandwich rule of giving 2 or 3 positive statements to any 1 negative or corrective. Where this got awry is that Fredrickson and Losada analyzed reams of data they had and concluded that there's a particularly perfect ratio of positive to negative, 3 positive to 1 negative, that is going to optimize motivating students. Not true. Not true. So the principle is a good one, that positive reinforcement works more successfully than punishment paradigms or negative reinforcement, but a ratio of 3 to 1, there just really isn't supportive data, particularly in the gifted education field, that this leads to more successful outcomes. So both of these researchers, Carol Dweck with mindset and Fredrickson with the critical positivity ratio, started on something that was really interesting and exciting, but it got carried away in a very simple way and translated that led to nothing that was very useful in gifted education. So let me stop on myth number 6, and let's go on to the next slide. Continuing on, let me briefly mention 6 more myths that exist in the gifted field. And these are courtesy of a dear colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Jim Webb, who sadly passed away a few years, but he was really one of the leading thinkers in the social and emotional world of gifted children. So he's a good name to have handy if you want to read up on additional information on myths in the gifted field. So the gifted can succeed without special help. This is really a common myth among many educators and parents, that gifted kids are so smart that they really don't need special help or assistance. And nothing is further from the truth. Gifted kids, like all kids, need good teaching, instructing, mentoring, and assistance. So they do need special help. The next myth is that gifted kids are not aware that they're different. And this also is a myth. By that, I mean it's not true. It's not correct. Gifted kids, like all kids, are aware of their strengths and their talents and their abilities and things that they're not that good at. So gifted kids are aware that they're different, that learning and schooling comes easier to them than other youngsters. So that's a myth. Gifted kids are aware that they're different, and in some areas they have special talents. This is true in the arts, in sports and athletics, in dance and theater, just like it is in the classroom. Gifted kids are aware that they excel in certain unique areas. Okay, another myth is that gifted kids enjoy serving as models and tutors for other less gifted kids. And this is an interesting myth that I'll point out, even though today's lecture is on identification and assessment, but this is really an important one to mention because too often in the United States, gifted kids who get their work done very fast, teachers assign them to help students who are slower. And it's really almost like they're working for no salary or money as an aide in the classroom. So it's not an appropriate role for gifted kids to be assigned to help slower learning kids, unless the classroom has built into it in its social emotional learning activities where kids learn to help one another. But it should be transactional where all kids are assigned activities to help one another, not just the bright kids when they're done with their work, instead of just sitting quietly or said, hey, help these kids who are slower. Okay, the next myth that Jim Webb talks about is that gifted kids' level of social emotional maturity is always at the same level of their intellectual ability. And this is a myth, not true. Quite often, we find that high intellectually gifted kids are just average in their social emotional maturity. And in fact, some gifted kids are way behind in their social emotional maturity or EQ. And in fact, I just recently wrote a book this year called Parenting from the Heart, which speaks to this very point that we need to pay attention to the social emotional learning skills and character development of gifted kids, because their level of social skills and character development quite often doesn't match their intellectual ability, and we need to focus on that in the home and in the classroom both. Okay, the next myth is that gifted kids are very easy to parent. And let me just mention that's not necessarily always the case. Gifted kids are like all kids. Some of them are very easy to raise and parent and to have in the classroom, but others are very challenging. They vary tremendously, just like any child. And the last myth is really a pernicious, really no different than any other student in the classroom, because really the myth goes, all kids are gifted. And my own view is that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, it's not a helpful view to hold. I think we recognize that certain kids have unique talents in sports, in music, in dance, in memory and mathematics and the arts, and not all kids are gifted. That's just a fact of life. Okay, on to the next slide. So that leads us to, who are the gifted? So let's spend a little time talking about who are gifted and talented children. And you'll hear me use the interchangeable terms gifted, gifted and talented, high ability. I'm really talking about the same student, the same child. And this slide visually depicts that what I'm talking about, that gifted kids can be gifted in one or many areas, not just the classroom. So the first picture is a young girl who's gifted in athletics, in what you call football. In fact, that's a picture of my daughter, who was a very good football player when she was young. The second picture shows a child who's gifted in academics and reading. And the last picture shows a child who's gifted in music. So children can vary in their gifts. Next slide. Okay, so what do we mean by gifted? And here I have a picture. It's sort of a humorous picture. It's a young girl who's doing what we say is an amazing thing. She's flipped over and can drink out of a coffee mug using her feet. Amazing. But I think most people would agree when you look at this that this is a very specific, unique talent, but it's not what we mean by gifted children. So let's think a little more about what do we mean about when we talk about the gifted and talented child. Next slide. Okay, so there's quite a few questions that we need to ponder as educators, as testers, as psychologists, as principals, as administrators, when we struggle with this idea of who are the gifted, because we need to struggle with this if we're going to go about identifying these kids in a rigorous, scientific, careful way, which I advocate. So, a number of questions. One, what exactly should the criteria be when we talk about gifted? Another way of talking about this is what should be the thresholds that a child needs to exceed before we consider them gifted. Important to consider if we're going to go about identifying kids. What criteria should we use? And when we identify the criteria, it might be 2, 3, 5, and we'll talk about this shortly. What is the threshold for each of those criteria? For example, in my model of giftedness, in a tripartite model, which I'll be talking about shortly, there are three different ways to look at gifted. And one is children who excel academically in the classroom, outstanding academically. But should it be just the top child, or the top boy and the top girl child? Or should it be the top 3 children, or the top 5? So even if we agree on the criteria, such as the top performing student in the classroom, what's the threshold? 1 boy, 1 girl, 3, 5 children. We need to be clear before we start identifying what criteria we're using and what the thresholds are. Next question, when we talk about what do we mean being gifted, how important is intelligence? Clearly, as I mentioned earlier in my lecture, intelligence historically has been one of the most important criteria that has been considered in identifying gifted children. But how high should the intelligence be? Should it be 110, 115, 120, 125, 130, 132, 135? How high should it be before we say, yes, this student's gifted, this student's bright, but not gifted? Okay, what about academic skills? Is that important? In my model, it is, but how advanced should their academic skills be? Another important factor. What about memory? Many authorities in the field, myself included, argue memory is important. A student's ability to learn new information quickly is important. But how important is what we talk about speed of processing information important? In certain fields, it's critically important. If you want to have a gifted pilot flying a jet, they need to be able to process information very fast to keep you safe as a passenger on a plane. But in other fields, such as in the arts or writing, you don't need to process information quickly. So we want to be thoughtful in how we conceptualize what do we mean by gifted. And should the criteria shift or change as the child gets older? what we consider when we're looking at kindergarten children or nursery school or preschool children? Should those criteria shift or be different than when we look at middle school children or high school? We'll talk a little more about this as we proceed. Next slide, please. Okay. This is a picture, in fact, of the book I mentioned a few minutes ago, my new book, Parenting from the Heart. It essentially focuses on the social, emotional uniqueness of gifted and talented children and the character strengths of gifted and talented children and how we can develop them in the classroom and in the home. So, 4 facts that we have a lot of scientific support for among gifted and talented kids. 1, they learn at a faster pace with greater appreciation for depth and complexity of information. That's an irrefutable fact. Gifted and talented kids learn at a faster pace with greater depth. And typically, the higher their IQ level, the faster they learn and the greater depth. Second fact about gifted and talented youngsters in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Czech Republic, in Austria, and in the United States. They often find themselves bored in the classroom because classrooms often are not well equipped to challenge their intellectual and academic status. So that's a second irrefutable fact, that many gifted and talented children worldwide find themselves in the classroom bored, and that can create problems. Third fact about gifted and talented children, they often struggle to fit in to the normal social recreational activities that exist in the school, in the classroom, in the playground. Not always, but often, they don't fit in easily. And the fourth irrefutable fact about that seems to depict gifted and talented children is that many of them, not all, but many, experience heightened feelings of sensitivity and emotional overreactivity. Many, not all, but many. Many are what we call asynchronous. By asynchronous, we mean there's not a balance in terms of their social, emotional, academic, intellectual status. They're out of sync, asynchronous. They're out of step with their peers. So these are 4 irrefutable facts that we know after very careful research exists for many gifted and talented children globally. Okay, next slide. Okay, so from my earlier slide, remember I was sort of teasing and saying the girl who could stand on her from her feet was amazing, but not gifted. Here we have a picture of 2 examples of both amazing and gifted adults. And I put up adults versus children because I think sometimes it makes it easier for us to begin to understand what do we mean by gifted when we stop thinking about children and we switch to adults. And I'll be talking more about that from the talent development models that I'll introduce. But on the left, you're looking at the picture of the world record holder from Russia in women's pole vaulting. I talk a lot about pole vaulting because I was a pole vaulter in high school and college, so I use it as examples of giftedness and development of skills in pole vaulting. So she's amazing. She's able to jump 16 and a half feet. It's 3 feet higher than I was able to jump. She's really, quite an athlete, very gifted. And on the right, I have a picture of a group of surgeons and nurses doing open heart surgery. I think we'd all agree it's both amazing and quite gifted that in the medical field, they are able to do these very complicated procedures to save human lives. So I think these are two good examples of when kids grow up, they can be amazing, gifted adults. Okay. Next slide. I know you're going to have another speaker shortly presenting to you, my dear friend and colleague Javier Turan, Dr. Turan, and he'll be talking about different models of giftedness. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I think as part of a lecture on gifted identification and assessment, it's helpful to at least introduce to you this idea that there's not one model of giftedness. There are many different models. And what I've depicted here are 4 different models. And there's probably, I write about 300 different models in the gifted field, but these 4 sort of are umbrella depictions of the most broad models of gifted and talent. The first one is the psychometric model. That's one that you're familiar with. We've talked about it already. It's based on high intelligence or high cognitive ability or high IQ, and those terms are used interchangeably: IQ, cognitive ability, intellectual ability. So the psychometric model says high intellectual ability defines giftedness. There is no one threshold that's the proper or correct threshold, but generally in the gifted field, people talk about 2 standard deviations above the mean, 2 standard deviations above the mean as demarcating gifted. But there's no science behind this. It's just sort of, it's been tried and proved over 100 years. So 2 standard deviations on an IQ test is a score of 130. And that's why the field has sort of embraced 130 IQ, because it's 2 standard deviations. It's the top 3 to 5% of the population. But there's no science to that. We could say a 120 IQ is gifted. Spain could take that as its standard, and that could be accepted throughout Spain. So there's no magic to 130, but that is what's been used for many, many years. So that's the first model. The second model is the one that I like to follow, the talent development model. So the talent development model is a different model than the psychometric because it looks at, from an organic and changing and interactive way, how potential of God-given gifts evolves and changes and flourishes over time. So it's a model that brings together nature and nurture, whereas the psychometric model is a more static model that looks at nature, high IQ, that the way you're born. But talent development model looks at what a child might be presenting with at age 2, 3, and 4, and then what can the parent do? What can teachers do? What can the school do? What can the community do to encourage their talent over time? We'll talk more about that one. The third model is called the expert performance model. It argues that the psychometric model is not useful because the environment plays the huge in developing gifts. Practice, coaching, sustained effort. These are terms within the expert performance model. One of my colleagues, brilliant researcher from Florida State University, Professor Anders Ericsson. Anders sadly passed away a few years ago, but he came up with this expert performance model. Essentially, his argument was, with the right teaching and coaching and mentoring and practice, I could make almost anyone an expert in any field. And he, in fact, has some provocative findings that he was able to make experts in competitive chess, in surgery, in flying jet airplanes. And it was just through the right type of structured practice. So I don't agree completely with Anders Ericsson's expert performance model, but I think it's a useful alternative way to conceptualize what do we mean by how do gifted kids develop. And the last model you're probably familiar with, it's called the multiple intelligences model. That fourth model was developed by Howard Gardner, Professor Gardner at Harvard University, and he argued that we put too much emphasis on intelligence, on cognitive ability, and that rather than looking at gifts as a unitary concept, we should look at it across multiple domains. And his model has 8 or 9 different domains that he looks at, way beyond just academics and IQ. So they're different models. No one model is right. No one model is wrong. They're just different ways to be useful in looking at gifts. Next slide. Okay. So the first model, the high IQ model, this is sort of a fancy scientific depiction of what we mean by giftedness is high IQ. Again, it's one model, not the only one. You have to decide whether this makes the most sense for you. But essentially, it's showing that the way we look at intelligence now are based on 3 levels of intellectual ability. At the highest level, you can see the small letter G, and that stands for general abilities. But then there's a second level that are called or considered broad factors of intelligence. And really, that's where most of the activity and research and exciting work in the gifted and talented field is happening, not at the high general ability level, but the second level of broad factors, verbal ability, spatial ability, memory, and a few other broad factors. And then at the lowest level, researchers have found that there are many, many specific abilities that feed into these broad factors. So I share this just to give you a visual depiction that this one model of intelligence really now consists of 3 levels or 3 factors. Okay, next slide. Okay, Abraham Tannenbaum, he was a brilliant theoretician from Columbia University. He's no longer alive, but he came up with a model, probably the first, I think, talent development model, and I love it. I mean, it's an older model, but it's great. I think it explains for me my understanding when I work with high ability, gifted, and talented kids. His model is called the STAR model. And he said essentially that developed talent, whatever it might be, in whatever the field, exists primarily in adults. And that's why I focus on adults and not little children in understanding giftedness. He said that gifted classification, and that's what we're about and why I'm lecturing to you, he said really should denote potential for kids to become critically acclaimed performers or producers of creative ideas, that we should be making predictions when we work with 5 and 6, 7 and 8-year-olds, which kids are going to be most successful in being exemplary performers or producers of creative ideas. So he's linking essentially this notion of what is the promise that kids bring to a situation at a young age with how do they fulfill their potential when they're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. So he said when you do identification, you want to look at that little G, general ability, the apex of that triangle of the three levels I talked about. That's important, he said. But he said, in addition, we want to look at that next level of specific abilities because they go into ultimately fulfillment of promise, such as memory, speed of processing, visual skills, nonverbal skills. But he said personality factors play a very important part. Why do some kids develop to be super scientists and great dancers and great authors and others don't? And he said, in addition to general ability and specific abilities, personality factors play a role. And I think for those of us in education who've worked with kids over the years, we know, yeah, personality factor does play a part. It explains why some kids are highly motivated, why some kids are persistent, why some kids get very excited with challenges, whereas other kids get anxious with new challenges, other kids get afraid to take risks. So this speaks to the personality factors that go into Tannenbaum's STAR model. And then environmental opportunities. There's no question over the years in my working with kids that what families provide in terms of opportunities make a difference in the development of talent. What communities offer or don't offer. If a kid comes from a very poor community where there's no theater and there's no art activities on the weekends, they have no opportunity to develop what might be a latent potential ability. So environmental opportunity also is important in Tannenbaum's model. So multiple factors in the STAR model. Next slide. Another model, useful one, I like this model, is Joseph Renzulli's three-ring conceptualization. Professor Renzulli's still active in the field. He's a professor at the University of Connecticut here in the United States. Essentially, his model is a different one. And let me say again, no one model is right or wrong. They're just alternative ways for us to try to understand what do we mean by this construct gifted. So what Renzulli said is that there's three things that go into giftedness. High intelligence or above average intelligence, he said. Doesn't need to be 2 standard deviations above the mean, but he said high intelligence, maybe 120 IQ. But also creativity as a second factor, he said. We need to have kids who have good level of creative potential, and we need to nurture that. And the third factor he talked about in his three-ring conceptualization or his three-ring model was, he called it task commitment, but we can call it motivation. So he's talking about above average intelligence, above average creativity, and high motivation. When those three factors exist in any given student, Renzulli says, aha, now we're talking about a potentially gifted student. Above average intelligence, above average creativity, high motivation or task commitment. This is the three-ring conceptualization. Okay, again, this isn't the best model, it's not correct model, and the others are incorrect. It's just one useful way for us to conceptualize what do we mean in our school by gifted kids. This is how Renzulli views giftedness. Okay, next slide. So what I'm depicting here, and I hope it's not too much information, is when we look at the different models, and here I just put 4 up. Remember I said there's over 300, 350 different models, but these 4 main models each model leads to slightly different ways to go about identifying gifted students in your schools. So if you're going to proceed with identifying gifted students and you're using a psychometric model, you approach the screening and identification different than if you use the talent development model, which is my model, or an expert performance model, or a multiple intelligences model. So the model that you are using as you think about gifted is going to direct you to what tests and tools and scales you select to go into the classroom and try to find gifted kids. Okay, so let me give us an example. In the psychometric model, remember, that's based on high intellectual ability. 2 standard deviations above the mean, the top 3 to 5% of students. So following this model, if this was the model you like, you believe in, you think it's helpful in Spain, then you would come up with selecting a good intelligence or cognitive ability measure, administer it to a large number of students, and select the top performing 5%. And you'd say these kids, based on their performance on the test, qualify for being considered gifted. That's how a psychometric model would guide gifted screening. Different than a talent development model, which my tripartite model fits into the talent development model. From a talent development model, you don't give one measure, you give multiple measures over time. So you might have 3 or 4 or 5 different measures based on what you think are the most important aspects of optimizing students' performance. Might be in the arts, in theater, in dance, in debate. And you measure over time because you believe, based on a talent development model, that talent isn't static. It changes. Some kids can flourish and get stronger, and other kids, sadly, don't continue to develop beautifully and fall behind. So you need to measure multiple times as they get older with multiple measures. So I won't go into all the models, but this just helps to give an overall picture that the model you like, that you feel comfortable in how you understand gifted, is going to lead you to how specifically you go about screening and finding gifted and talented children in Spain. Okay? I know that's a lot to digest. I apologize. I could spend hours just talking about the models, but I wanted to give you an overall to emphasize models are important. You should be able to, if a parent asks you, how are you going about identifying my child? You should be able to say, well, I'm using the psychometric model, or I'm using Professor Pfeiffer's tripartite model, or I'm using Anders Ericsson's expert performance model. You should be able to say what model you're using, and that's why you're using these particular tests. Okay? Whew, that's a lot of information, I know. All right, next slide. Okay, so let me spend just a little more time on the talent development model and the talent development perspective, because my tripartite model is based on this view of human development, of giftedness. So all my work over 46, 47 years, all my research, all of my testing in the schools, all of my lab work, all of my students' work is based on, we view giftedness from a talent development perspective. So the picture again is of my younger daughter, who was a football player and was very, very talented, identified at a very young age as having a lot of ability for a 4, 5, and 6-year-old. She wasn't a great football player at that age, of course, but She could run fast. She could jump high. She could scan the field, the turf very well. So she had precursor abilities that led her to develop over time to become a very talented football player. So what I've depicted here in my model is that there's 4 steps along the way to becoming an expert in any field. It could be organic chemistry. It could be trigonometry. It could be astronomy. It could be IT work or graphic design or surgery or an attorney, law. What we found is that in any human endeavor, complex human endeavor, humans go through essentially the development of 5 steps to become the most eminent in their field. In the beginning, it's just being a novice. So for my daughter here in football, she would play on the field and she was fast runner and she could change direction well and kick a ball further than other kids. She was a beginner, but she showed beginning skills that you would say as a coach, I like that kid. I'm going to watch that kid. I may try to get them on my team because they look like they have potential. The next level, the second level in the talent development perspective, is called reaching competence. That's where whatever the field might be, you move from being a novice to becoming competent in what you're doing. Hello again. We left off on step 2 of the 5 steps in a talent development perspective, competence. So you move from beginner, you could be gifted at a beginner level, but you're working with the student or the athlete or the musician, the dancer, to become competent. That's the next step in the talent development perspective. From competent, we move to expert or excellent. So you can be very competent in dance or piano, or I might have been competent in pole vaulting, but with good coaching and mentoring and studying and working hard and practice, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice, you move from competent to becoming excellent in whatever that field that you're interested in. We think of academics in the classroom, and that's true and correct, but really we can expand that to almost any culturally valued field or domain that is important. From excellent, though, we don't stop there. What we find from a talent development perspective is that we can still encourage learners to become elite. In this instance here, it's elite football players, but it can be elite mathematicians or lawyers or surgeons or attorneys or lawyers or scientists, professors. And then the highest level, the 5th and highest level in a talent development perspective is really available only to very few people. And those are those who are eminent in the field. So in football, for example, it might be a Messi. Clearly, he is at the most eminent level. He's one of the top scorers and performers in all of football worldwide. Many more people are at the elite level and playing professionally, and we go and pay a lot of money to watch them play, and also at the expert level. The kids we're working with really are at the beginner and competent level. So this just gives you a broad perspective that it takes many years, a lot of practice, training to move from the talent development perspective to the highest levels of creative performance in all human endeavors. Okay, next slide. So, yeah, that's great. This slide is great. Here, what I'm showing essentially, and I could have had pictures of scientists in the laboratory, or artists painting and drawing and sculpturing and modeling. But I like to think about the development of the talent of football. And in the United States, they actually follow the model that I advocate in the gifted world, which is a talent development model. And it's called the ODP, or Olympic Development Program model, taking very young children, identifying them at an early age, and working with them over many, many years so they reach the highest levels, the elite level. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but let me talk a little bit about it, because I'm hoping that you as the audience, as the viewer, can make the connection from what I'm talking about in football to applying it to the classroom, to children, students in the classroom. So from the Olympic Development Program model, the first thing from a talent development perspective is we just don't look at IQ. Remember, IQ, or general ability, is important, but we look at multiple factors. So if you like this model and you're looking at academically gifted children, similar to looking at football talent, point one is that you have multiple screening and assessment measures, not one, but multiple screening assessment measures. In the Olympic Development Program, they actually look at five. They look at five. They look at strength on the pitch. They look at speed. They look at agility. They look at the skill set in football. And the last, remember we talked about Tannenbaum's personality, the STAR model? They look at coachability. Coachability is an aspect of personality. So they're saying when we want to get a super talented young player and develop their talent over time, we look at their strength, not just IQ, but their strength, their speed, their agility, their skill set, but also, are they coachable? Do they respond well to feedback from coaches? Some kids do, some kids don't. So they look at these 5 different measures they test. And then every year they test them again, because they recognize kids change over time. Kids don't all stay change. And then they also test or validate their measures with how the kids are really doing on the field, on the pitch. It's not enough just to measure strength and agility and speed and skill set and coachability, but who are the kids who are really performing during games? In the same way that I argue in terms of academic giftedness that we should have multiple measures, measure them every year, but also look at how the kids are doing in the classroom. That should be something that we measure. And as kids get older, what we look at should change. I say here, number 4, criteria changes as the football players get older. The same should be in the classroom. The criteria that we look at for 10-year-olds should be different than the criteria we look at for 5-year-olds. And the criteria we look at for 16 and 17-year-olds should be different than the criteria we look at for 10-year-olds. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. So this colorful picture depicts my model, Pfeiffer's model, my tripartite model of giftedness. I introduced this in 1998 and expanded upon it over the next 10 to 12 years. Essentially, the tripartite model of giftedness looks at academic giftedness from not 1, not 2, but 3 perspectives, multiple perspectives. The first perspective, the first triangle there, the purple triangle, it looks at high cognitive ability. That's the first perspective. A young student based on Pfeiffer's tripartite model, could be considered gifted if they have very high cognitive ability. It's pretty easy to understand. That's the first lens, I say, or perspective to understand academic giftedness. However, in my work over the years, I realized not every student tests very high on IQ tests, but some kids still are fantastic, fabulous in the classroom. They really are. So I came up with a second way of looking at academic giftedness, which I call the outstanding accomplishments perspective or lens. So from this second alternative perspective, we're considering academic giftedness not based on high IQ, but based on, is the student like the number one or two student in their class? Are they consistently coming up with great papers, creative designs, wonderfully unique answers to problems? Those kids I consider are gifted based on this second perspective of outstanding accomplishments. That's the red triangle in the middle, number 2. And the third perspective in my tripartite model, the orange triangle, is what we call potential to excel. And potential is the key word, potential. These are kids who may not be the number one kid in the class. These are kids who may not test very, very high on cognitive ability or IQ. So they don't qualify based on the purple triangle, high cognitive ability. They don't qualify as gifted based on the second triangle, the red triangle. They're not the number one or two kid in the class, but there's something special that teachers can sense about these kids that leads teachers to feel if these kids had different opportunities, they'd probably be really great kids. So we call it the potential to excel, the almost gifted. And in my model, the tripartite model, kids can come from 1, 2, or 3 to be viewed as gifted. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So one other aspect, the tripartite model has 3 lenses, 3 perspectives, not just one. And it's also a talent development perspective that kids can change over time. A child might not be gifted at age 5, but they could be gifted at age 8 or at 12. So we recognize kids change over time, and we recognize that there are 3 different ways we can consider a child as gifted. But the last thing I emphasize here is that we appreciate that level of giftedness also varies across these 3 types of giftedness. And in our model, in the tripartite model, what we found evidence, a lot of evidence for, is some kids are what we call mildly gifted in high intelligence or outstanding accomplishments or potential to excel. But some kids are even higher than that, and they're moderately gifted, either in high intelligence, outstanding accomplishments, or potential to excel. Or highly gifted, that's the third level, or exceptionally gifted. So kids can vary in terms of their level of giftedness. Let me give you an example of each. So a mildly gifted child of high intelligence, in my model, might have an IQ between 120 and 130. If you went about testing kids in your school district where you work, and you found a kid with a 120, a 125, a 127 IQ, that child would qualify for being considered academically gifted in my model based on high intelligence, mildly gifted. Okay. Now, what do we mean by moderately gifted? Moderately gifted is a child with a higher IQ, but it also might be a child who's let's say, the number one child in their class, in all their academic work. The teacher thinks they're creative, they're innovative, all their work is just beautifully done. So they would qualify for academic gifted based on outstanding accomplishments at a moderately gifted. To get up to be highly gifted, they might need to be the top student in the grade in sixth grade. And they would then be considered outstandingly gifted based on the third level of gifted. So there are three different ways to identify kids as gifted and four levels of gifted. Okay, a little confusing, I know, but as we continue, hopefully it'll make more and more sense. Next slide. And this slide essentially brings what I've been talking about together. That in the tripartite model, there's four levels of giftedness: mild, moderate, high, and exceptional, across three different types of giftedness. Okay, and you can see here we have the cutoffs. So in the high, you might have an IQ of 110 to 119. But at the level 2, it might be 125 to 135. So this gives you, if you're doing gifted screening, an opportunity to view kids from three different perspectives and four different levels of giftedness. You have more flexibility in screening and finding kids who are gifted. Okay, next slide. What I've put up here for you is what I consider a working definition of academic giftedness. Let me read it to you. I wish I could read it in Spanish to you. The gifted student demonstrates a greater likelihood when compared to other students of the same age, of the same experience, and the same opportunity, who achieve extraordinary accomplishments in domains that are valued in the Spanish culture. Okay, let me read it again. The gifted student demonstrates a greater likelihood. Remember, we're making predictions about what's going to happen in the future for the student when compared to other students of the same age, same experience, similar opportunity, that they're much more likely to achieve extraordinary accomplishments in culturally valued domains. So I've been promoting this definition for many, many years. I think it's helpful in guiding gifted identification. Okay. Next slide, please. So let's take a second. I'm going to take a deep breath myself, and let's review what we've covered so far in today's lecture. So first, I've talked about the many myths in the gifted education field. There are about 10 or 12 prominent myths. They're not truths, they're not facts, they're myths in the gifted field, and we need to be aware of them. Okay? Second thing we've covered so far, there are different models, different ways to conceptualize what we mean by this construct, giftedness. I said giftedness is not real in nature, but it's useful. It's a useful way that we humans categorize kids who are special. And there are different ways, what we call models, to help us conceptualize giftedness. The high intellectual ability model is just one way, popular, but only one way. Talent development models, another way. We have Renzulli's three-ring conception, another model. We have Pfeiffer's tripartite model, another way. So there are different models, different ways to conceptualize giftedness. And the third point here, and this is critical to today's lecture, is how we conceptualize giftedness, how we think about giftedness, how we understand what we mean by gifted kids in the schools. That should guide how we go about identifying these kids. Okay, we should always be guided by the model that we believe in helping us to select the tools that we use to identify gifted kids. The fourth thing we talked about is you've heard me as the speaker today say that I embrace, I support the talent development perspective. I developed one model, the tripartite model, three ways of looking at giftedness, four levels of giftedness, but it fits within a talent development perspective. I recognize, like Abraham Tannenbaum in his STAR model, that kids develop over time, that many factors go into continuing to fuel high ability or gifted kids. And I talked a little about my tripartite model. It offers three different lenses or color triangles to view academic giftedness. And then last thing I talked about, that there are many different levels of giftedness. It's not like once you identify a gifted kids, for example, can be handled, educated in the classroom very nicely by a teacher. But if you have a child at the highest level of giftedness who might test at a 170 IQ, it's very, very hard for any regular teacher to make the accommodations that are needed for that level of giftedness. And we can talk more about that, but the educational programs and interventions need to be sensitive to level of giftedness. Not all gifted kids are the same. Whew, we covered a lot. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, what I'd like to introduce now is a topic very important in my work. My 2015 book, Essentials of Gifted Assessment, in fact, talks about this, best practices in gifted identification. So I'm going to talk about 7 considerations in going about best practices in gifted identification. Hopefully I won't go too fast, but very on Amazon, my book, if this is something that you'll be involved in gifted identification. And I have a chapter on each of these that walks you through each of these considerations. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so remember I said 7 best practices. The first best practice in gifted screening, gifted identification is recognizing that, and I'm going to say this and repeat it because it's really important. Giftedness, the concept gifted, is a hypothetical construct. It's not real, but it's useful. It's not something that's real, as I said, like childhood diabetes is real, but it's a very useful construct. So it's important that you as an educator are able to adopt a clear definition of what do you mean by gifted. So when another teacher asks you, what do you mean by gifted? You're able to say, this is how I believe in gifted. And you can use Pfeiffer's definition, or later you'll hear Dr. Turan's definition, but you want to be able to give a clear operational definition for how you conceptualize giftedness. Very important. Too often in the field, I consult with schools and I talk to educators who are actively screening students for giftedness. And I say, what is your definition of gifted? What model are you using? And they say, I don't have a definition. I don't have a model. I just use the Wechsler scale, or I use the Binet, or I use the Woodcock-Johnson, and that's the score I get tells me if the kid is gifted or not. And I go, oh no, we need to step back before you use those instruments, and they're good. Each of those instruments are really quite good, but you first need to have an operational definition of what do you mean by what is a gifted student? And I've already this morning been talking a lot about different definitions and models. So that's the first best practice in gifted identification. The second best practice, I believe, is that you don't use one test or one measure or one screening tool. You always use multiple measures to identify students who are gifted. Always use multiple measures. In the medical field, and in my field of clinical psychology, we call it triangulating the diagnosis, triangulating it. So we don't rely on one measure. We use multiple screening tools, multiple tests. For example, I was asked by the New York City schools to come up with a screening procedure to identify in kindergarten all the students who were gifted in New York City. And what we came up with were a few different instruments. We used my test, the gifted rating scales, and we used the OLSAT. And all the kids were administered the OLSAT, and all the teachers and parents completed my gifted rating scale. And then we looked at the scores on the OLSAT and combined them with all the scores on the gifted rating scale. And we ranked thousands of students in New York City school from the top of the top down. And then we identified which students were gifted based on 4 levels of giftedness using multiple measures. So multiple measures, triangulating is critically important. Don't use just one test, use multiple. If you have a medical problem, you don't go to a physician, you don't go to a medical doctor, and the doctor only uses one measure to determine whether you have a tumor and if the tumor is malignant or not. The doctor is going to use multiple tests, lab tests. They might use MRI or PET scans or X-ray, but they'll do lab tests, blood workups, and they're going to combine the different measures to determine the likelihood whether that tumor is malignant or not before they operate. In the same way in education, best practice is we should use multiple measures to screen kids for gifted programs. Okay, the third best practice in gifted assessment and gifted identification is we should only use reliable and valid measures. We should only use reliable and valid measures. What does that mean? When you're using a given test, you always want to check to make sure that the test has some scientific support, that it's reliable. If it measures giftedness, every time it measures it, you'll get the same score, that it's valid, that not only is the score reliable, but it's measuring giftedness. So measures need to be reliable and valid. There are many, many screening tools out there that are widely used when I consult with schools around the country here in the United States and when I've gone to Europe. And the instruments that are used are not reliable or valid. I ask, let me see the manual. And they say, oh, there is no manual for this rating scale. Well, then I get a little anxious and I say, wait, best practices is that you only use reliable and valid measures. So this is a very important idea. Only use scientifically good instruments. The fourth best practice, and I've talked a little about this from the talent development model, that you need to be flexible. Don't use the same set of tools for kindergarten kids that you use for 5th and 6th graders. The tests that you use, the instruments, should change based on the age, the developmental level of the child. In America, we say we got to be careful. It's not one size fits all. That's true for tests. Tests are designed for particular purposes, particular age. And as kids get older, you should use different instruments. Okay, so those are 4 best practices. Let's look at a couple more. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, the 5th principle of best practices: screen before you test, screen before you assess. First, you screen kids, and then those kids who screen high, then you can do a more comprehensive evaluation. The same is true if you do women go through breast screening, right? You don't get a comprehensive, expensive, full assessment to see if you have breast cancer. First, you go through a simple, inexpensive screening. And those women who come out with a higher score, meaning they have a higher or elevated risk, then the medical clinic says, come back, we're going to do more extensive evaluation. So you always screen first. And in the case of gifted, if they're more likely that they're academically gifted, then we do a full battery, full comprehensive. So screening first is a best practice. Okay, the 6th point in best practice is how you weigh or consider the scores you get. You might want to change how important they are as the child gets older. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're doing screening of 5-year-olds. I probably wouldn't put as much weight on academic scores as I would if I was screening 10-year-olds, because by age 10, they've had 5 to 6 years of formal schooling or more. So that you would put a higher weight or expectation that they should really be very, very advanced academically. So we want to developmentally retest every 2 or 3 years and give different weighting to the screening instruments based on how old they are. What we do for kindergarten children should be slightly different than what we do for 5th or 6th grade children in screening. And let's look at the next slide, the 7th best practice. I believe strongly that we should embrace a holistic approach, looking at the whole child. In my book here, Parenting from the Heart, I talk about both head strengths, like intelligence, creativity, problem solving, but also heart and soul strengths, like compassion and empathy, persistence, not giving up, love of learning, the kind of personality factors that go into giftedness. So we should always embrace a holistic approach when we are screening for giftedness. Don't look just at the head strengths, intelligence and creativity, but look at the heart and soul strengths of the child also. We should always, as educators, look at the whole child. So in my Parenting from the Heart, my heart strengths, we should look at emotional intelligence, social skills, and character strengths, those 3: emotional intelligence, social skills, character strengths. They're real important personality factors that go into the likely success of all students in the schools, including high ability gifted students. So I think a holistic approach, looking at the whole child, not just their head strengths, but their heart and soul strengths, gives you much more valuable information in determining which students are going to benefit most from gifted programs. So if this makes sense to you, hopefully you'll take some time to read my book. It's a paperback book, very inexpensive, easy to get on Amazon, Parenting from the Heart. And it gives you a lot of insights into the heart and soul strengths of children and not just their head strengths. Okay, we covered a lot. I know it's a lot to digest. Next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about next is introducing one test that's useful in gifted screening, my own test, the Gifted Rating Scale, or what we call the GRS. And it's the GRS 2 because it's just recently been revised and published. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about the gifted rating scale. I hope you consider using it. I think it works great for all students. We've validated in many, many different countries. It's been translated into many different languages. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the gifted rating scale. And again, I apologize. We're covering a lot of material. We're covering a lot of material in a short period of time, but hopefully you're digesting it and you have resources that you can dig deeper into the topics that we've talked about at your leisure. Okay, next slide.
This is really the final topic that I'll be talking with you about today. It's been a great journey we've taken together, and I hope a lot of what I've said makes sense, and I hope that some of the things have perked your interest enough that you're going to delve a little more deeply in learning more about them. So the last thing I want to talk to you about, the last thing I want to introduce to you is my scale, the gifted rating scale, as I've mentioned. There's the gifted rating scale and the newly revised gifted rating scale too. So let me just give you a little history on the gifted rating scale. When I took over as executive director of the Duke University Gifted Program on the campus of Duke University, the most popular test used in gifted identification was the IQ test, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale and the Stanford-Binet. And they're both great instruments, and they both complement the high ability model. But as you know, my own interest is more in a talent development way of viewing giftedness. And as you know, based on best practices, my own particular bias is that we need to look at multiple measures, multiple perspectives in identifying high ability, gifted and talented students. And I thought, in addition to an IQ test, because IQ tests are great, I mean, they do a great job doing what they're intended, but there were really no good rating scales, teacher rating skills that existed. And there were no good parent rating skills that were really scientifically good in helping to identify gifted students. So my students and my colleagues and I at Duke University undertook to develop a new test, the gifted rating scale, to complement IQ tests. They don't replace IQ tests, they complement them. You use them hand in glove with other measures. So they were designed as a screening tool. So remember I talked about multiple perspectives. And I said whenever you measure anything, you should always have multiple perspectives, be it breast cancer or diabetes or learning disability or autism spectrum disorder or giftedness for that matter. Whenever you're measuring something, you should have multiple perspectives. And I also felt that in the gifted field, there was no rating scale that takes into account the parent perspective. The original gifted rating scale I developed, and we took 3 years to develop it, was a great scale that measures the teacher perspective on student abilities in 6 areas. But we said, we really also want to develop a measure that takes into account the parent perspective to provide a more complete and comprehensive view of a child's growth and ability in multiple settings. And that's the reason why we spent a number of years developing a parent scale that we use with the teacher scale. So the gifted rating scale now consists of 2 tests, a rating scale for teachers and a rating scale for parents. Okay, next slide, please. So this here depicts the GRS2, the new gifted rating scale 2 parent form. The purple to the far left shows that the scale measures a parent's perspective of their son or daughter's cognitive ability. So it looks at high cognitive ability as one of those tripartite model perspectives. But the red triangle in the middle shows you that the parent form also has items that measure outstanding accomplishments. So the parent rating scale, and there's only really less than 20 items. Some of them measure high cognitive ability. Some of them measure outstanding accomplishments. And the third measures this potential to excel. Kids who are unrealized but could become gifted with the right opportunity. Parent scale also measures resiliency and personality strengths, because if you remember, I feel very strongly that we want to look at a range of areas of ability within the child. Okay, so we can, in fact, jump ahead to the next slide. That's perfectly good. Great. Next slide. Okay, so the GRS2 has a parent scale. It also has a teacher scale. Teachers are given the scale. They can complete it in 3 to 4 minutes. It's really quick, 3 to 4 minutes, and you can complete all the items. And it measures 6 different dimensions. It measures intellectual ability, both verbal and nonverbal mental skills, memory, problem solving, processing speed, reasoning ability. So there are items that measure intellectual ability on the gifted rating scale teacher form. It also has items that measure the academic abilities from the tripartite model. Remember, we're not just looking at intellectual, we're also looking at in the classroom academic ability. So it has items that measure factual and school-related information, proficiency in reading and math, kind of things that you teachers are well aware of. There are items. The third scale on the GRS2 teacher form measures creativity. It asks teachers to rate a student's ability to think, act, and produce original, unique, novel, and innovative thoughts and products. It's a measure of creativity, and it really works very well in addition to measuring academic ability and intellectual ability. The fourth scale on the GRS2 teacher form measures artistic talent. It asks the teacher to rate students on their ability in areas such as drama and music, dance and drawing, painting, sculpture, playing a musical instrument, acting. Very simple, easy to complete by the teacher. And what's beautiful is it's scientifically reliable. It works. Easy to complete, but it also is an accurate measure. The fifth type of giftedness that we measure on the GRS2, the gifted rating scale 2, is leadership. Leadership is an area that we think is very important. It's one of those social emotional skill areas. And we have items that ask teachers to rate a student's ability to motivate other students, to listen well, to act responsibly, to stay calm during heated discussions, and to inspire trust and cooperation among others. So leadership is a really important area that we measure. And the last of the 6 scales that we have on the GRS2 teacher is motivation. Remember, we talked about from Renzulli's 3-ring model, motivation is important. We talked about other models like Tannenbaum's model talked about personality and motivation fits into that. We're asking the teacher to rate students on their persistence, their desire to succeed, how excited they are with challenging tasks, their ability to work and not give up when they encounter difficulties. So motivation is our 6 scales. There's 6 scales on the teacher form: intellectual ability, academic ability, creativity, artistic talent, leadership, and then finally motivation. So this is the teacher scale. It starts at age 4, it goes up to age 18, and it provides you with a very simple set of numbers on how high a child is in each of these 6 areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so the parent scale, we have, remember, a teacher scale and a parent scale. The parent scale measures 3 domains. The teacher scale, 6, intellectual ability, academic ability, artistic talent, creativity, motivation, leadership. Those are the 6 that the teacher rates items on. The parents rate items that measure 3 broad abilities. The parent scale generates a score on cognitive ability, on creative artistic ability, and the third are those soft skills, the personality that we talked about. That's so important in understanding the whole child, the complete child, resiliency and social competency. So on the parent scale, you get 3 scores: cognitive ability, how high is the child cognitive ability, creative artistic ability, and resiliency and social competency. So taken together, if you use the parent scale, which takes 3 minutes to complete, the teacher scale, about 3 to 4 minutes, in less than 6 or 7 minutes, you have a very comprehensive picture of a child's abilities in a wide range of domains, from a teacher perspective in the classroom and school, and from a parent perspective in the home. So we're real excited because the research that we conducted in the United States and Canada and then in Europe found that the tests work. Not only are they easy to administer, quick, easy to score, but scientifically they're reliable and valid. So exciting. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the scientific validity of the GRS-2, the gifted rating scale. We use the term psychometric properties, or how scientifically valid is it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm summarizing here hundreds and hundreds of pages of data that we have that you would find in the manual on the GRS. If your school district purchased the GRS, you would find that it's very reliable. The teacher form with those 6 scales, the parent form with the 3 scales, very precise, very consistent. If you give a teacher the form on November to complete, and then again in February or March, you're going to get very consistent scores. If you give a teacher the form to complete in September at the beginning of the school year, and November or December, very precise and consistent. So that shows you that the test is reliable. But is it valid? Is it measuring giftedness? And in fact, yes. Much research that we conducted, but also other researchers around the globe have conducted, have found that the test is valid. It measures giftedness every time it's used by teachers and by parents. So we were thrilled with the results that we found. Is it fair? Is it fair? Does it work the same way for all children? Children of color, children where English or Spanish isn't the first language spoken in the home, children of immigrants, children coming from poverty, And what we found is, yes, it's equally fair for all kids. Equally fair for all kids. So real exciting. Next slide, please. Okay, so this essentially summarizes, and I don't want to spend too much time because I'm sure by now you're very tired. Your eyes are probably glazed over and you're going, oh my gosh, more information. So I'm going to go through this real quickly. Essentially, the standardization sample, the normative groups that we used to develop the teacher GRS2, the parent GRS2, were large, and they closely matched, in the United States, our 2018 census. So they're fair based on age and gender, race and ethnicity. They come from all 4 regions of the country. And we included parents in completing the form with no high school education all the way through parents with high graduate degrees. We wanted to make sure that the standardization sample was fair, equitable, representative of all teachers and all parents globally. And in fact, it is. It is. Next slide, please. Okay, so quickly, because this is a presentation in Spain, let me talk about the Spanish translation of the GRS2, because we have that and it exists. Sort of exciting that the publisher, MHS, said, yeah, we think it's important enough that we're going to develop the GRS2 in Spanish. Next slide. So what we found is with the translated version of the GRS2, the Spanish translation, it works as well as the original English version. We were thrilled because we were very anxious and worried, would it work? When we do translation, we did very careful backward and forward translation. Is it going to measure the same things with the same accuracy or preciseness? And it does. What this slide shows you is that it's high internal consistency, very high. English and Spanish, almost identical, the internal consistency indices. We were thrilled with this. We didn't know when we developed it. We hoped it would be scientifically valid. We hoped it would be reliable, but only data would show whether it worked or not. And in fact, as you can see here, the median omegas for Spanish and English are almost identical. It's working equally well for English and Spanish parents and teachers. Next slide. Okay, this fancy graph is showing theta scores for English and Spanish, and what it shows is that statistically, the tests are almost identical, irrespective of whether they're completed by Spanish teachers and parents or by English teachers and English parents. There's no meaningful differences between the Spanish scored and English scored GRS2. The test functions essentially equally well in identifying gifted students, Spanish, gifted students, English. Again, we were delighted with these results because it shows conclusively from a scientific perspective, the test works in English and it works equally well in Spanish. Next slide. Okay. We're at a conclusion here. This is sort of exciting. I hope you're not too tired. I hope you're saying, boy, I'd like to hear more from Professor Pfeiffer, but I'm kind of exhausted. It's been a long lecture. I've covered a lot of material about gifted screening, about gifted identification, but I've been delighted to share my thinking and my experience and my work over the years. And what I've included here are resources that I actually relied on in creating this talk and the PowerPoint slides. These are books that I've written over the years that talk a lot about how to do fair and equitable identification of gifted and talented students. Parenting from the Heart, my most recent book, talks about the whole child, not just the head strengths of gifted students, but the heart and soul of gifted and talented students. You can see here the Gifted Rating Scale second edition is posted here because I relied a lot in talking about the new GRS2 so that you get a sense that there's more than just IQ tests that are used in screening and identifying gifted students. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I only wish, as I said at the start, that I was there with you in Spain so that we could have a conversation now and talk about some of the things that perk your interest or raise questions that you want more information about. I hope you now go out and investigate further about gifted identification and gifted assessment. You can pass along any questions you have to the leader of this program, and the leader, I'm sure, will be delighted to send me emails of the questions, and I'll answer them and get them back to you because I want to be responsive to any questions that you might have. And I want to wish you much success in continuing your work or launching your work in identifying and serving high-ability, gifted and talented students. It's been my life work, so I'm very committed to it. I get very excited when others are interested also in working with gifted and talented, high-ability students. So I'll say goodbye at this point. I'll wish you much success, and I hope at some future date that I actually get to see you in person and get to meet you all. Bye now.